Wonderful. So I want to extend on behalf of the University Library a very warm welcome to you today on this rather chilly morning, and to thank you for coming to our latest installment of our colloquium on scholarly communication. And for those for whom this may be your first time attending one of these particular series, I want to take a moment and give you a brief sense of the scope and purpose of this programming series, because at the end of our time today, we're going to be asking you for recommendations about topics or other speakers that you might want to see in the future. So basically, when we reflect upon the traditional missions and roles and the functional role of academia within the overall society, one of our core missions is the creation of knowledge, and we include in that, of course, the various forms of the arts as a type of knowledge. And in particular, that type of knowledge that will never necessarily become profitable, because we need to have some place in the society that is outside of the methods of like R&D departments to be creating that type of knowledge that would not be happening outside in our economic system. So with the emergence of what we're currently calling kind of the digital first age, we as the Academy have an unprecedented number of opportunities to really reflect upon this part of our mission and to ask ourselves whether or not the tools and the systems that we have built and put in place over time to fulfill this mission within a print-centric world continue to be serving us as well in a digital world, and whether or not they need to be augmented or replaced by new systems and tools. So exploring this type of topic and thinking is really what this colloquium is about. We wanted to provide the university community and many of our friends and colleagues elsewhere with the opportunity to come together and to be thinking through some of these various big picture topics. So as I said, if there are other speakers or other topics that you would like to see addressed, we'll be passing around some slips at the end, and I really encourage you to fill those out. So today we are extremely, extremely excited to have two of our own. That's how we're going to claim them here. And they're going to be talking about the ways in which we may be wanting to measure impact that are beyond traditional bibliometrics. So Rachel Borchardt is our science librarian, and she also does a number of other things in addition to being our science librarian. And, oh, I forgot to mention, they both have a book that is coming out that we're very excited about as well. And that it will be entitled Meaningful Metrics, a 21st Century Librarian's Guide to Bibliometrics, Altmetrics, and Research Impact. So Rachel joined us before joining us at American University. She was the biology, neuroscience, and behavior biology librarian at Emory University, and she has earned both a BA in neuroscience and psychology from Oberlin, as well as her MLIS from the University of Pittsburgh. Robin, we are very happy also to welcome back. She was formerly our communication librarian, and she is currently the instructional design and outreach librarian at the University of Washington Libraries in Seattle. So she has also earned both a BA and an MA in literature, the BA from UCLA and the MA from UC Santa Barbara, and her MLIS from the University of Washington. So welcome, and very excited. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gwendolyn, and thank you, AU Library, and everybody who came today. This is a topic that Rachel and I have been thinking about literally for years. And this is the first chance we've had to talk about it publicly since we began work on this book. And so it's a really exciting moment for us, and especially nice to see so many folks who we know from the world of libraries here, since this is one of the audiences we really want to speak to, but also to other folks who are thinking about impact in relation to their disciplines, to their work, to their teaching too. So we'll try and cover some of this. We're going to have time at the end for questions, and so what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about impact and what it means both generally across academia and to us as librarians, and two specific movements within impact, bibliometrics and altmetrics. But a lot of this topic is really personal to us. Depending on what you do, you may have different questions. So please bring that back to us at the end. We're happy to kind of move in directions that relate to what you're thinking about today. All right. So when you talk about impact, this is the first thing that Rachel and I had a lot of thinking to do about. Impact means different things to different people. How many of you have seen this movie, Deep Impact? Yeah, I know lots of you have seen it, right? It's great. It's a great movie. I really enjoyed it. We thought about this a lot in our book. And you know, when you think about impact, normally what you think of is actually something more like this. Maybe not this movie, but we think of something big and something very obvious. You know, when you talk about making an impact, you kind of assume everybody knows what that means. And it's something, you know, maybe not catastrophic, but it's something significant. But when it comes to the way each of us talk about impact as academics, it's actually very subtle and very different. So the way that I, as somebody who has a background in literature, immediately think about impact, I might think a lot about publishing books or articles in certain types of publications. Someone like Rachel, who has a background in science, psychology, neuroscience, might be thinking about funding, might be thinking about very different sorts of metrics and also sort of outputs. So that's one thing that we want to really tackle today is sort of what does it mean when we talk about impact? And then related to that, how do we go about measuring it and how have we done that? How are we doing that now? So measuring impact is difficult. Again, when you don't know what you're talking about, it's hard to say there's only one way to do it. There are lots of different tools out there, lots of different strategies for measuring impact of all sorts. The difficult part is kind of looking to understand what tools are available and what it is they measure well. So you can think about, you know, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you take one type of impact, it's going to work, or impact metric, it works really well for measuring certain types of outputs, certain types of disciplines, but depending on where you are, there may be different metrics that are available to you, that are useful to you, and we want to make sure that you know about some of those, that history and also some of the tools by the end of this presentation. Okay. So when we talk about the famous tools for measuring impact, the most famous one that many of us may already know is impact factor. It's also called journal impact factor because it does operate at the journal level. In the 1950s, a man called Eugene Garfield, who's pictured on this slide, this is the best picture I could find of him. He had many lovely ones. This is the one I liked the best. He actually has a background in chemistry as well as library science, and he was interested actually in looking at citation patterns and how we go about figuring out who's been talking about research, who's been talking about who, how do we trace that for purposes of collection development as well as for research. And so he came up with the idea of creating a citation index, and this is the basis that became later on the Science Citation Index, also these other ones behind a database now we know as Web of Science. Basically, by looking to trace different citation patterns, we could find out how many times maybe a journal article had been cited and really look backward and forward across that pattern of scholarship. And so around the same time that he was coming up with these indices, he decided that it would be interesting to sort of do some calculations based on journals. So what he did was come up with this really famous tool or resource called Journal Citation Reports. Yes, thank you, Rachel, for looking at me as I said this. Journal Citation Reports. And this is part of now Web of Science. So this is an early version, not the earliest. It came out originally in the 1960s. But this is the 1996 copy, and it gives you a sense of how it looked for a long time. What it basically did was list a bunch of journals, traditionally in the sciences, since they're the richest in terms of having a citation culture around journal articles. And it asked the question of, basically, for each journal, how many citable items did it produce? So let's say it's articles, maybe some reviews, and then looked over a period of 3 years and said how many citations were generated based on these articles, all these possible citable things. And it came up with an average score. So let's say that if you had the annual review of immunology, that over this kind of 3-year period, if you looked at it in the most recent year, each citable item generated 47 citations on average. It's a very high number of citations. But it was meant to give you a sense of how much impact one of these journals have, who's been reading it and who's willing to cite it again. So you can see that there's quite a long list of journals. Not every journal got included. It was really based on those that had enough of a publishing record and enough of a citation pattern that you could really rank them. But it became a rankings that people used to determine which are the best journals, which are the most impactful journals on average. And then this could come out each year, so you get a better sense of, over time, which ones were doing well. You can also see there are other numbers on that same page. This is because in addition to looking at it over, say, a 3-year period, Garfield and his compatriots recognized that you might want to do the same type of calculation over, say, a 1-year period, see who's getting citations quickly, and that's called the immediacy index. I won't go over all of these too much in detail, but it's really to get a sense of how impact was talked about for a long time, really from about the 50s or 60s going up to about the 90s or so. All very much based on citations, which is the foundation of bibliometrics. So this is what we were talking about for a long time. Today, journal citation reports is one of the major tools, probably the major tool for talking about impact. So for those of you who are tenured or tenure track or have had to do things about justifying your impact, if you publish articles, most likely you may have heard something about, well, what's the impact factor for that journal? And it's because they're expecting you to go to journal citation reports and to look up this information if it's available for your publication. It's really become, again, such a major tool that it's taken over our idea of what impact means. So you can see this is the advertisement from Thomson Reuters, which eventually bought ISI, the company that was making these journal citation reports. And it has this really large claim against the world's leading journals. It's to measure influence and impact on every category. There are some problems with this idea. One thing that I'll mention is that if you're someone in the humanities or arts, there is no report for you. They basically said there aren't enough citations in order to generate a ranking. There are rankings for the social sciences, but there's not a lot of refinement between, if you're someone who's in a field, say library and information science, that's conflated together so that the information-focused journals are in the same category as library journals. So it's really not necessarily the way that you really think of your research, and that's been a problem for determining where you stand in the rankings, and also for other fields, including the sciences. Not surprisingly, there's been some backlash, really for over 10 years, about this idea, is really impact factor supposed to be this powerful? Is it really such the best way of measuring impact, even for those who really are focused on journal articles? And really within all disciplines, this question has popped up. Clearly within the arts and humanities, there's been a lot of discontent about the fact that they don't have the same types of focus on journal articles nor the same resources. But very much in the sciences too, actually. Some people say that the impact factor has increased over the years in ways that don't really reflect the way that we really do research or the way that citation patterns really happen. And for those in the social sciences, they've complained that because they're combined with the sciences, their numbers look really small and therefore they aren't respected as much when really it's just a more complex set of fields and outputs. This is a comic from PhD, Piled Higher and Deeper comics, if you're familiar with it. So there's been a lot of even satirization about, the fact that impact factor, is it really even in the first place a great algorithm? There's a lot of things it's really not accounting for when you're looking at it, and Rachel will talk more about this later. So recently there was a conference, I think it's the American Chemical something group, but they had a meeting in San Francisco, and they put out a declaration called DORA now, Declaration of Research Assessment. But they basically said they don't want to use impact factor as a way of determining quality anymore. They don't want to say if you're an author who's published in a high-impact journal, does that mean your research is high impact? And they wanted to say no. There are hundreds of signers of this document now. You can find it online. But it's really kind of rattled and become this sort of calling for we really need to look at impact more seriously, even though we've discussed it for a long time. I mentioned that outside of the sciences, there are these great groups like the humanities, close to my heart, and they've really said, we would love to have a tool, just a tool, that would help us with our citations, even though we don't have a strong citation culture because we focus so much on books, we still could use something. So there's also been some interesting research on the other side of things, trying to help the arts and humanities come up with metrics that would be useful to them. In the meantime, though, most of the time, and this is actually true not just for the arts and humanities, you find scholars are going to free online tools like Google Scholar that still allow you to count citations and look at patterns, because they just don't feel like Web of Science and this group that produces journal citation reports is accounting for all the ways that citations are happening today, including some of which are only available online. So I don't want to go into too much in detail about other sorts of new trends in bibliometrics, but I will say this is still a really important part of impact, and it's in a continuous state of development. There's a couple other groups other than Thomson Reuters that are really working on this idea of how do we calculate impact based on citations. So this is one. This is called Simago. They're a group, you can find this online, they're a research group, and they basically said, what if we just changed the algorithm a little bit? I mentioned that it's sort of an average of citations over time for impact factor. They just kind of tweaked it a little bit and said, well, what if we accounted for some other factors here? And you can see there's something called SJR, that's Simago Journal Rank. It looks almost the same as impact factor, but it is a slightly different calculation, which means that you might see some journals move up and down lists. This is also a calculation that's been done for other fields that aren't represented by JCR. So this is one that's done for history. You can find them for the arts, for the humanities, as well as for the sciences. They also filter by country to show that there are differences in publication patterns in different geographies. So it's great that these tools are proliferating, even though, again, they're really still, in this case, focused on citation patterns. So if you're interested, I really encourage you to look at this. One reason it's also different is this data is based on Scopus records rather than Web of Science. So it's just a different collection of citations. Okay, that's a lot about bibliometrics, so I'm going to hand this over to Rachel to talk about this other really important impact pattern and topic, which is altmetrics.
So we've seen that bibliometrics is really starting to change. We have more tools now, more ways to measure citations and the journal impact. But people started thinking, is there a better way? Is there more that we can do to measure what it means to have impact within research and within academia? Enter altmetrics. What we realized is that with 21st century tools, scholars are no longer just engaging with journals within other publications that they write. There's a lot of ways in which scholars are interacting online. So on the left-hand side is just a abbreviated list from Amazon to Zotero, which isn't even on that list, of ways in which scholars are interacting with these research products, not just journal articles, but other forms of scholarly output, such as conference presentations, white papers, dissertations, and so forth. And with these tools, we now have the ability to kind of peek over a researcher's shoulder and see what it is that they're looking at as they look at these tools. And not only that, we can measure to what extent they're really engaging with these tools and what level of attention these products are receiving. So that's kind of the central theme and focus behind altmetrics, is to go beyond citations to take other measures of impact and bring them together to create this kind of fuller picture of what it means to have impact within the field. So these are two examples of products that take all of these different outputs and kind of pull them together to create some meaningful metrics. So on the left-hand side, we have a product, altmetric.com. It works exclusively with journal articles. So it's kind of one of the big limitations of it, and it has to have a DOI. But it literally tracks that DOI as it moves around online spheres, and then kind of gives you overall impact measures. So it's got a score in the middle of what it calls the altmetric donut, which is designed to show overall level of engagement and attention with that particular journal article. And then you can see the different colors represent different spheres of influence and engagement with that product. So you can see there's actually a wide variety of sources. It's not just journals and online citations, but we look at scholarly networks like Mendeley, like ResearchGate, where scholars are finding, downloading, and using articles. But we also include social media like Twitter and Facebook, because people are also talking with each other online, not always through scholarly communication means, and it tracks all of that together. So on the right-hand side is another tool, Plumx, which also summarizes a lot of these metrics. Each tool takes kind of a different set of metrics, and Plumx is actually owned by EBSCO. So one of the things that it takes that the others don't is up at the top, the usage, where we can actually go into EBSCO and say how many people are looking at the PDF, at the HTML, at the abstract of this article in EBSCO. So it's a different type of impact than citations, but it does say something about whether scholars are looking at that article before they have time to cite it. But we can also see with Plumx that we not only capture all these metrics, but they're starting to sort them into different categories. So you can see the main colors are the different main categories within Plumx: usage, captures, mentions, social media, and citations. And this is done to try and keep it from just being flat numbers that don't necessarily carry much meaning, to say different types of engagement and attention that they're receiving. So that way, it's not just everything is altmetrics, but we can look at different types of altmetrics. And I think that's a really important point to make about altmetrics, that not all altmetrics are the same, right? So if we're looking at something like social media, it's not necessarily the same as citations and usage, and it says different things about that article. And this is the third major tool. It's called Impact Story. And what we can see here is that we can not only look at how individual works are receiving an attention and engagement online, but we can also start to collect together different works at different levels. So this is an example of collecting works together at the author level. So this is their sample profile that they make available on their website, where this researcher, Carl Bettinger, I think is his name, has pulled together everything that he does, and this is not just journal articles, but it also includes conference presentations that he's put on SlideShare. It includes data sets that he's making available through Dryad, through Figshare, through GitHub. All of these online tools where people can make their works available, but didn't necessarily receive citations in the past. Now we have ways to show people are using these products, and this can pull it all together in what they call like an online CV. So it's kind of like a complementary look at a traditional curriculum vitae. The other thing that the tools are starting to do is not just tell you categories and usage and the raw numbers, but they're starting to contextualize the usage as well. And it's hard to see because this isn't quite big enough, but the little buttons that are blue and green have very specific language in them. Things like cited and highly cited. I can't see the other ones. Viewed and highly viewed. And what they're doing is taking the overall number, say, of number of times a SlideShare presentation has been viewed, and are comparing it to other SlideShare presentations to tell you relative to all of these other works, how much attention has that received. So the highly cited means that it's been viewed, cited, saved, etc., more than 75% of the other similar works. But one of the big problems right now is the contextualizing really depends on the information that you can get from the original source. So they're bringing in these sources from all different places like SlideShare. But for example, SlideShare doesn't tell you the category of the presentation. All they can tell you is there was a presentation that was uploaded in which year. So when we do the contextualizing, it'll say it's received more attention than 75% of the conference presentations in SlideShare for that year. However, in Mendeley, which is an online social network for scholars, we also get discipline categories. So if, say, an article is in Mendeley, it can tell you if it's highly viewed or used or downloaded as compared to other articles in that discipline for that year. But it's not across the board, as you can see. It just depends on how the original tool is categorizing those metrics. So an interesting start at trying to create appropriate contextualization for these works, but there's definitely still a ways to go. And it is worth noting that what we can pull into these types of tools isn't necessarily the whole spectrum of what's available. There are private networks. ResearchGate is a really good example of one that actually does create its own metrics when it comes to how many people have looked at the abstract, how many people have downloaded articles. But it's a private system that doesn't make that information available to anyone but its users. So you actually have to physically log on to ResearchGate rather than having something like Impact Story, which collects it along with other metrics. So that's one of the big issues. Another big issue that we're seeing is that not everyone is online, right? So take Mendeley, for example. It is way more popular amongst the sciences than it is among social sciences and even arts and humanities. So if I'm pulling something from Mendeley and I have 4 readers and it's in arts and humanities, it's not necessarily an accurate representation of how well it's being tracked in Mendeley, because a lot of papers aren't in Mendeley to begin with. There aren't a lot of arts and humanities scholars in Mendeley. So it could be being viewed, but not in Mendeley. So those are some of the issues with Altmetrics. And now we take a look at some of the controversies and trends surrounding Altmetrics, starting with the cheetahs, or people who try to game the system. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.
She inserted that slide when I wasn't looking and had to explain it to me.
It's the librarian in me. But one of the things that often comes up whenever we discuss Altmetrics is it's so easy to game the system. If you are active in online social networks and you're promoting your own things, your numbers are going to increase, you're going to be highly viewed, there's going to be more attention and engagement. And that is true. However, the savvy researcher in the 21st century probably should be online promoting their works. So where do we draw that line between appropriate promotion and intentionally gaming the system? And it's something that's still being discussed. However, the tools are getting smarter, which is wonderful. Altmetric is a good example in that they now have the sophistication to detect bots. So if there's a Twitter bot who's just constantly posting about one article or a small group of articles, they will flag that now and remove those metrics. So I think as Altmetrics continues to grow, develop, and gain sophistication, that the tools for detecting and removing gamification is going to grow as well. And it's worth mentioning that this isn't something that's just restricted to Altmetrics, right? Gaming in bibliometrics has been and it continues to be a thing. However, most of the time scholars are fair and honest, right? And aren't over self-citing, or at a journal level, they aren't being told that they have to include more citations to that journal. It does happen, but it doesn't happen that often. And I think that Altmetrics is the same way. Some of the other trends that's happening with Altmetrics, one of our big issues, is just trying to collect all of the metrics together into one single product. So say I write an article. It may have a URL to the abstract, a separate URL to the PDF, maybe a third URL to the HTML version. We then get shortened links by things like bit.ly, and if it has a DOI, that's a whole separate URL in itself. Depending on how people then cite or post on Twitter, they could use any one of the 5 URLs that I just mentioned, and unless I can figure out a way to bring them all together, I'm going to have 5 different sets of metrics. And just within our 3 publications that Robin and I have produced, we've found that problem. That I think both of us went into Mendeley, or someone went into Mendeley and created 2 different versions of our same article, each of which has readership, and we have no way of knowing how many of those readers saw both versions, or if we should be combining those metrics together. So it definitely remains a problem. Disambiguation of authors is also a problem. So which articles get pulled into an author-level tool like Impact Story. There are tools that are being developed. ORCID is one of the big ones, where you can assign a unique identifier to an author and attach it to any of their works. So that by pulling together by ORCID, we have a guarantee that all of those works belong to that specific Jane Smith and not some other Jane Smith that's out there. One of the third issues is one that I already kind of raised, which is that not all the disciplines are going to benefit from Altmetrics in the same way. That until there's kind of some agreement within the disciplines about this is how we're communicating in these online spheres, and we all use academia.edu, we all use Mendeley, or we all use something, that the metrics that we get aren't going to be very necessarily trustworthy indicators of true impact. So finally, just some developments and hesitations as they exist right now. I know, I love this. This was from yesterday, and I was like, this good timing. But we'll start with the positive, which is that Altmetrics are gaining ground. It is easier to tell now what Altmetrics can mean. But one good way to kind of convince people that Altmetrics are worthwhile is to correlate them back to the existing bibliometrics and to correlate them with each other. So what that chart on the left is from a study in 2012 that just looked at different types of metrics and what the correlations are between each other. And we actually see some very good correlations. Some of the highest correlations are between things like PDF views and downloads, and then citations. The correlation, I think, is about 0.7, which means that the patterns between those 2 sets of data are similar about 70% of the time. Similarly, with something like Mendeley, if you have readership for Mendeley, it can predict the citations about 50% of the time. So there are correlations, and this does have meaning, all the way down to Twitter, which I believe the correlation is about 0.12. So it doesn't mean that it's not saying something. It just may not be saying something about the later citation possibilities for that particular article, right? But even with all of this, we can't always tell. We can say, yes, this article is getting attention, but we don't necessarily know why, right? So this would be a case of an article which is currently receiving an awful lot of attention, but we may not necessarily see an increase in citations as a result. So I'm going to turn it back to Robin.
Great. And I'll just mention briefly, even though it's probably obvious, again, you'll note that these are similar weaknesses in certain ways between bibliometrics and altmetrics. And that goes all the way back to that first idea about what is impact. And it's difficult. It merely depends on what you're looking for. If you are looking to always feed it back to citations, I think that tells you something about what's appropriate for you. And if you're looking to something more about engagement, citations, actually I love that last example because it's a terrible citation. It shows you why we cite sometimes too, and that's not exactly what we want. But so it's just something else to think about. It's just, again, this is a shared problem about what it means to make an impact, and it's not a solution that we can tell you today, but it's something I think that I still am very interested in. So we thought we'd end today before questions with just a little bit about where we see this going in the future, and I think we've hinted to some of that, but Rachel and I sat down and we kind of came up with 4 ways that I think that really not only where Altmetrics and Bibliometrics are going together, but also what librarians and other academics who are motivated can do about where it's going. So that's what we'll leave you with before questions. I had fun picking out this slide since this used to be my university too. So what I want to highlight for you is 2 things I think about a lot with Altmetrics especially, but also Bibliometrics. And the first thing is this idea of the institution, academic institutions. Institutions have needs. There are things that go on about why we search for impact in the first place. Also, again, as we mentioned, the fact that institutions themselves may be interested in that larger perspective on impact. How is American University doing in terms of both engagement and overall patterns of citation by department or as, again, the entire university? And I think it's a direction that we're going to see Altmetrics going. In fact, we had this idea about a year ago, and around the same time is when PlumX, one of the tools that Rachel mentioned, became very popular. One thing that's great, if you want to check them out, is they let you kind of go into an institution's perspective on both engagement and citation. So you can see their example is the Smithsonian. So if you want to see how many researchers that are affiliated with the Smithsonian, and if you were to take all of their engagement metrics and put it together, basically anyone who's been identified as part of the Smithsonian, what is the most popular paper? What is getting the most attention out of what the Smithsonian produces? You can find that with PlumX, and that's a really exciting direction for Altmetrics because, again, it just answers a different question about what the university is doing well or other research institution. So this is something that librarians, I think, and academics in general are really in a key position to do. A lot of the time, Altmetrics are being developed by individuals or by very small groups of code-savvy people who are interested in this for personal reasons. And they don't always know what it is that you know so well about what this needs to do to be interesting, to be useful to you. So librarians communicate frequently with faculty, with administrators, and we're used to communicating with vendors. As we saw, since some of these are being bought up by places like EBSCO, also Elsevier that bought this Mendeley Research Network that we talked about earlier, we're in a position to make those conversations happen and say, hey, this is a really great tool, but it's not doing this, and we really need this to happen and for this to be a legitimate metric for purposes of evaluation. So that's something that we think that can happen. The other thing that I think librarians and faculty can do that's an interesting direction is this idea of disciplinary metrics, or what it is that unique disciplines need in order to use metrics effectively. Librarians, we think about the disciplines a lot. We have specialties, and of course academics are know exactly what it is they need to do as part of their own manuals and departmental expectations. I think there may be really interesting ideas there that we could communicate again back to vendors to say, hey, you know, this is a really interesting piece that folks in literature produce. So a good example of that actually is going on right now is book chapters. What if we can attach DOIs to book chapters and then trace this book chapter that I wrote and how its engagement is happening around it and also citations? If we could do that really effectively, then that's a really great representation of what actual researchers and professors are doing that is a little different than just finding all the citations to a book. So there are tools that are already in production for that, but as librarians we can really represent that and really push it out further. And then, of course, interdisciplinary efforts are also part of that conversation, since if you have someone you're working with who's in a very different discipline, you're going to have a difference in expectations for impact. That's even something we can talk about within our own institutions, so that if you're working with someone from the sciences and you're a social scientist, there's lots of literature about scientists who are basically worried that that will bring down their impact, their number of citations, if they publish in a journal that's really from the social sciences, since it's less of a citation culture. It's a conversation about expectations, but also maybe figuring out the right place to promote research and to publish it in the first place. So again, this is all part of what we already know, but bringing it out to the people who are making it happen, and maybe becoming developers ourselves in some way, which is something we can talk about at the end.
And I think finally, we need to start being more comfortable just stepping onto our soapbox. So hopefully there aren't any kittens in your soapbox before you step onto it. But as librarians and as faculty, we can really help make a difference in how altmetrics are talked about. This takes place in a variety of levels, from just educating people on how to use these tools to advocating to support more of these tools through research dollars, through increased staff support, and those kinds of things. Oh no, I forgot what I was going to say. I knew it was going to happen at some point. But as librarians, we can also talk with all of our different stakeholders in the process. So not just the researchers that we work with, but also the tool makers that are currently providing things like PlumX, and saying, this is how it could work better for our users. Maybe we need different instances of it for those different disciplines, and not just have a full list of all of those metrics, some of which are completely meaningless for some of those disciplines. But we also need to tell the researchers, you need to have that discussion and make sure that you are using the tools and talking with other researchers in your discipline about what is most appropriate to use to measure impact in your field, because there is no one-size-fits-all. And I think that if you take away one thing from this presentation is when it comes to research impact, it is highly specific to different disciplines and even sub-disciplines as to which tools make the most sense. So I think as librarians, it's our job to make that known and to show those tools, but we are not the decision makers as to which ones are the best ones to implement at a department level, at a university level, or even widely within academia. We are starting to see some disciplines that have kind of banded together. Mathematics is one of the most notable areas, in that in, I think, 2009, the American Mathematical Society actually published a letter saying journal impact has nothing to do with mathematics. It is a really bad way to measure impact in our field because of their citation culture, in that the most recent isn't always the most impactful articles within mathematics. Something that was written 30 years ago could have a surge in today's world as easily as something that was written a year ago. So it's actually something that they include in their tenure files when they're being evaluated. Don't use impact factor because it doesn't tell a meaningful story in mathematics. And I think that they can serve as a really good example of how other disciplines can take ownership of the metrics and craft them in a way that's meaningful. Another way that librarians can help be present and move this forward, and faculty as well, is being involved in the national conversations that are happening right now. So obviously things like presentations, but there's also a national initiative that's underway. It's NISO. I can't remember what NISO stands for, but they have a large project right now to look at altmetrics and start to standardize altmetrics. And that's one of the big issues that we have right now, is that we can't even agree on what a strict definition of altmetrics is. It's kind of a grassroots, grown up from social media concept. So now we're starting to get organizations that are involved with it to try and give it more structure. And the more that we can be involved with that, the better it's going to be a representation of how we want altmetrics to proceed. But if we continue to kind of sit and watch, then we lose our chance to really shape this exciting field. I think with that,
so we thought with, sorry, we have one lapel and two shoulders. So we thought at this point we could go a couple ways. One, we're really eager to hear your thoughts and questions, comments. We also can take a look at some of the tools that we've referenced that are shaping both bibliometrics and altmetrics now and in the future. And then we want to make sure you have time to eat things and enjoy yourselves and maybe have private conversations with librarians and colleagues. So we'll start with any questions you have, and then we'll go from there. Thank you. Yes?
So one question I have is, how do you happen to know if any of these altmetrics, like which ones count, which ones track citations for and use as the universe of citations that they're counting things like government reports, which are sometimes very, expensive, rigorous studies,
Yeah.
but don't make it into journals because they're already required to be published by the government. Research reports by government-sponsored centers, and things like NBER working papers, which do make it into journals eventually, but make their big splash sometimes years before they make it into a journal.
Do Do you want me or you want you?
Either way.
So there isn't a tool that's really great on the reports front and on the kind of organizational and governmental publications front, but it's a very hot topic and has come up a lot, especially in fields that relate to medicine, social work, because they have a large stake in public outcomes. And so I would say this is another example of where we want to put that voice in and say this is where we want it to go. It's about communicating so that when people produce the reports, they have something that we can help, that will help identify kind of, citations could be one example, but really make it so it's easy to pull and see what's really going on with these reports, because it also could be data, could be a technique, could be something else that's not really citable. So it's a future area, not a current area, but I'm excited to say that it's a very hot topic right now, especially within those specific fields. So no. So if you want to do that, the best way to do it, and this is another good point, is we mentioned very briefly that the one tool that everybody's using, some people, we'd like to think people will use things like journal citation reports in case it's useful and it's very well accepted by administrators. But Google is actually one of the premier tools because of how much citation does happen just online. And that's just...
Scholar doesn't count those reports, but you're saying Google would count those reports.
You'd want to search for an identifier. And this is, again, something that we hope we could automate or somehow make easier. But if you have an identifier attached to your work, URL, multiple URLs, DOI, something that is really about, this is a work, I want to know what happens to it. You can search on it and see where it pops up. This is similar to those of us who are interested in teaching, which we haven't really talked about. Sometimes we discover a work that we've produced is used as part of teaching. And that's a really exciting thing, I think, that shows that we've done something great and that it's been useful. But there's really no way to discover that unless someone tells you or you search online and you find it. So that is the current best method. But then again, I think that in the next few years that's going to change. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah. Just that one of the big issues is just the searchability of things like government reports, that if they are PDF images, then there's no way to...
They're usually CR.
Yeah, but not always. And there's really not that many standards when it comes to how government reports are filed and then how they're crawled by something like Google. It also requires them to include something like a hyperlink that we can look at. If they are just mentioning the title of a report but don't have a link within the PDF to it, then the only way to really know is to be able to search that PDF by the title within Google. So standardization has a long way to go when it comes to especially reports like that, and really limits our ability to be able to extract information from them.
And just before it slips out of my mind, I believe it's February 5th, we're going to be having another one of these on persistent identifiers, such as DOI and ORCID. Much of what they are talking about depends on using tools like that, so I encourage you all to come. And I just wanted, before it slips out of my mind, to say that.
Yeah, but right now the only really good way to keep track of that is as an individual researcher to just be on Google constantly looking for the different variations of your URL, the title, like limiting your search to .gov, you know, things like that. It's a very manual process, unfortunately.
So there's this tension. I use Mendeley, and there's copyright prohibitions, right? So they want you to put many journals in one, you put the Postprint version, but not the PDF. People don't want to see the PDF on research. I mean, they don't want to see the Postprint version, they want to see the PDF. So there's this tension between how we respect copyright and also get views in these places. How do people think about that?
I mean, this touches on a lot of things, including open access, which is, you know, how many people can publicly view the end result. Because if you are publishing in, say, an institutional repository, and we have an AU institutional repository, but if it's open access, we can get metrics from something like that. I know one practice within Mendeley is just to have a link to wherever the paywall version of the journal is. So we'll still get a readership count within Mendeley. But then if you have a way on the back end to measure the metrics when they go into the actual PDF. So that's why PlumX's partnership with EBSCO is so important, because they're one of the only people that will ever tell you if someone ends up seeing your PDF within an EBSCO system, they'll tell you that. And this is actually, I think, another area in which Altmetrics can grow in the future. Librarians actually have a lot of this data. Through our databases, we can tell when someone clicks through to a PDF, but we can't always make that available or collect it at in a meaningful way for individual authors or individual titles or articles. We're usually looking at how much journal usage for collection purposes of should we cancel this title if people actually looked at articles within this journal. But in the future, I think it could be a really interesting way to kind of bypass some of these issues. But again, it kind of gets to the how it's put online will really limit or enable those metrics.
I would just add that something that I find very, let's call it interesting. It's good, I think, that because of this practice, both open access, I mean, ideally it's about making sure that people can find research and access it regardless of where they are. But postprint is, I mean, people don't reject things just because it's a postprint. I find oftentimes what people will do is they'll look at whatever is the most available version of a resource and then try and glean as much as possible from it. So even if you wish they would go to the best version because they do have access to it, that doesn't always happen. And librarians, we know that people will go wherever they can quickly and free if possible. So from a perspective of who's interested, or if you're looking from an engagement standpoint, it's still really good data. And I think that there's actually a lot of good things to be said about postprint versions and preprint versions of research. And there are a lot of sites like Archive, which is really about that, about kind of looking at what people are using and what they're interested in, even if it's not the final version. It's really a draft version of research and how they can get comments from readers who have knowledge about the same topics, and they can therefore make them better. And that's something that's become more and more acceptable really quickly, in fact. So that's just something else to add. Any other questions? Alex.
I have a comment and question. My first part is a comment, and I hope this doesn't embarrass you guys, but the Provost Bass just recently said that Rachel is a treasure of our university, so I just want to underscore the weight and worth of today's conversation. Well, my question is in relation to that, because it's related to both the work that you and Robin are doing, and then also your work with our faculty contracts and whatnot. What's your sense about the national landscape when it comes to using Altmetrics to be able to maybe change the way that we're able to measure for promotion and tenure decisions?
Yeah.
And not just here at AU, of course, but
Yeah, there's actually some published research about this idea of using Altmetrics as part of evaluation. And thank you for that comment about Rachel. I agree that she's a treasure. And I'm not from here, so I could say whatever I want right now, and it would just be it would be true. What I would say, and this is my personal, I feel like I kind of take, even though I really am a proponent of this new field, I take sometimes a more conservative approach than you could. There's a lot of different ways. But one thing is I feel like the adding in of Altmetrics is not a bad thing. I would not necessarily go out there today and stop using citation-based information as part of your evaluation if you've got it. Also, I'll mention that Altmetrics will never make up for a really poor portfolio. So if you've got a lot of tweets and you've not published anything, you know, you're not going to do that well in probably most evaluation cases. But there's a great article, in fact, by Jason Priam, who's probably the most preeminent scholar right now. He's the founder, he's the coiner of the term Altmetrics, and he's behind altmetric.org. And what he really recommends is, for example, when you submit your file for evaluation, you know, make all the case that you would based on, of course, the requirements of your department, but check the Altmetrics. Check as much as you can, in fact, and you may find a compelling story that you need to I want to say narrate, that's what I mean.
Narrate?
Narrate. You want to narrate using Altmetrics. So I'll give you a good example. It's really to say that, let's say you have a work that you've published and it's got great citations. Of course, you include that, but you've just put out a new work. How many faculty try and get out lots of publications at the last minute in journals they think are great, but there's no citation data because it just came out. But you do check to see maybe people who have downloaded the online version. There's often a preprint. If you can say within the first 2 months we've gotten this many downloads, that's information I think that just adds something rather than tries to make a monumental switch. But what's key to all of it, and I think this is another great takeaway, is you have to try. If you look and there's nothing there for you, then you looked and you may have learned something about maybe what works with your research, or maybe something that you want to do better and doesn't work right now. knowing is not a problem, and I think that in the end you have to make the call, but the biggest hurdle is getting people to look. And in the same way that all of us should be Googling ourselves and our research in general is just to see where it goes, if you've never gone to a site like Impact Story and set up a trial account, or if you have access to Plumex or Mendeley and you just look to see if do you have readers? I just think that it's the first step to changing things. And in some cases with NISO, that organization that's pushing standards, I will say the first stage, it's a 2 or 3 year project. The first stage they did was go and meet not just with faculty and librarians and developers, but with administrators, university provosts and presidents, and they got their feedback and their concerns. So I think that'll be another stage past just using it to making it so that it's really accepted in certain forms for evaluation. Did I answer your question, Alex? Okay. We should all use it, though, and that includes librarians, though. I would actually say that it's not just traditional researchers. Professionals have a lot that especially we might be able to find on this, especially if you do a lot of conference presentations or posters where there's evidence online.
And just in terms of scalability, I'm not sure that academia as a whole is ever going to say, yes, bring the Altmetrics on, this is exactly what we want. I think those conversations have to take place at a more local level. I think departmentally is within institutions makes a lot of sense, and we can actually use our own library as an example, that we now say if you're producing a file for action, it's incumbent on you to demonstrate impact, but how you do that is really on the researcher. So that I can now say, if I've had downloads and favorites of SlideShare presentations, that says something more about a conference presentation than just I presented. So I think that, but individual departments have to have that conversation as to how do we want to measure ourselves. And I think that, at least at this point, is the most meaningful way to kind of incorporate these different metrics.
Yes.
It seems that some of these tools, bibliometric tools, are owned by companies that are also content providers, journal publishers.
Yeah.
Should we be worried that they might be biased in the way they calculate bibliometrics because they would have an interest in favoring their own journals or their own content of another technique, or navigations of that sort?
So you're talking about how Thomson Reuters produces. Yeah, a lot of times if you take the time to go into the tool like Journal Citation Reports and go through, what they do is pretty public. You can kind of look through, and a lot of this research you find are people who go back, get permission to get these large data sets of the citations from the index themselves, and they can reproduce a lot of the research. Where you can, though, see some issues is because of just the fact that when these content, like groups like Thomson Reuters are calculating impact, it is only based on their world of information. And I think that that's, you could say it's self-serving, but I think it's more just because you have to draw the line somewhere, and if you don't have access to the data, then you can't. It'd be great to see Thomson Reuters and Scopus come together and norm things and delete duplicate stuff, and then, of course, our prices would jump really high for all of that content. But it's something that there are some interesting groups of researchers who are taking the time to do things like that. So I'm not so much a concern, but I think it's a reason why you can't, even if you have great numbers in, say, Scopus for how your work is doing, you can't stop there. It really isn't a full story. But luckily, I think they try and anticipate that, as well as why, for JCR's case, why certain journals don't make the list. That's one of the biggest questions I think we get as librarians is, why isn't my journal here? And I don't think there's always a great answer, but they have some discussion of why things are in the list and not.
And within Web of Science, there's actually an essay about how they make the decisions about what's going to be in there and not. You can look it up, just Thomson Reuters selection criteria, something like that. It's a 1 or 2 page essay.
I'm going to put in one more plug. Sorry,
Yeah,
I feel like the time is slipping. So yeah, so definitely there's lots of literature. I will also point out one example of a non-content provider affiliated research initiative related to bibliometrics is what's called IGENFACTOR. Which is a really confusing project. It's out of the University of Washington, a collaboration between, I think, like biology and the communication department. It's really exciting. It's basically they apply network theory to the idea of how citation patterns happen and try and give you a percentage of how much a journal's output, how much of the world of information it represents. So if you have a higher percentage, it's great. They draw on data from I think it's, yes, from Thomson Reuters, but they're a group that doesn't have an affiliation, and they have their own public metrics, and you can check that. So still limited, but I check it all. In fact, for better or for worse, JCR now includes IGENFACTOR in its list of 15 metrics. So there's enough of that accountability, but I'm not, it's not perfect.
Let's take maybe one more and then.
Sure. Or 0 more.
Or 0 more, that's great. So, good.
Well, wonderful, thank you so much.